Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you? Look, I know the bathroom here has been haunted for the last decade. There's nothing I can do about it. Employees just have to use the dumpster out back. And hey, there's always fresh roadkill for easy cleanup. Speaking of hauntings, today's stories are all about workplace ghosts, railroad demons, pig plant phantoms, and of course, a bathroom ghost. These are tales from the break. Settle in. Things are about to get creepy.
Story 1.
Demon on the tracks. I started working with a particular railroad company back in '96, inspecting tracks in the northwestern region. Most people don't understand how much maintenance railroad tracks need. These massive steel rails, carrying tons of cargo every day, expand, contract, warp, and wear down in ways that need constant monitoring. That's where I came in, as a track inspector, walking miles of isolated rail, looking for problems before they cause derailments. I'm getting close to retirement these days. My sister-in-law keeps telling me I should write down some of my experiences while my memory's still sharp. Mostly, I think she means the stories I tell her kids, about wildlife encounters, and some of the strange characters you meet in remote rail towns. But there's one experience from the summer of '04 that I've never shared with them. Never shared with anyone, except my supervisor at the time, and he transferred to another division not long after. Back then I was 8 years into the job, still trying to prove myself. I was a single guy, dated here and there, but nothing serious. My brother Christopher had died months earlier, a sudden aneurysm at 36, leaving his wife and 3 kids under 10. I spent most of my off days helping her out, taking my nephews to Little League games, my niece to her dance classes, trying to fill in for Christopher where I could, though nobody could replace him. That June, I got assigned to inspect a 40-mile stretch of track cutting through a remote area of eastern Montana. The line had been reporting unusual wear patterns that didn't match normal usage. My job would be to walk sections of it with specialized equipment, taking measurements and documenting any anomalies. I checked into a small motel in the nearest town, about 45 minutes from where I'd be working. Just a basic place with wood paneling and scratchy bedspreads, but it had hot water, and it was clean enough. The woman at the front desk perked up when I mentioned I'd be working on the rail line. She asked which section, and when I told her, her expression changed slightly. She mentioned her grandfather had helped build that stretch back in the early 1900s. He always claimed it was cursed ground, that the original survey team had all died under strange circumstances after plotting the route. I nodded politely, but didn't put much credit in it. Every small town has stories like that. Railroad folklore is full of ghosts and curses. It comes with the territory of a job that's claimed a lot of lives over the decades. My first day on site was uneventful. The rails looked normal at first glance, but my measurements showed subtle deformations that couldn't be explained by normal wear and tear. The patterns were very symmetrical, appearing at exactly the same intervals for nearly a quarter mile in what we called Section 17. The precision was what bothered me. Nature doesn't really work with that kind of regularity, and neither do train wheels. I also noticed my equipment behaving strangely in that section. The electronic measuring devices would fluctuate wildly, and my fully charged batteries drained to nothing in under an hour. I had to switch to manual tools, the old-school calipers and levels that railroad men had used for a century. It was approaching dusk when I first saw him. I was taking measurements about halfway through the section, kneeling beside the rail with my back to the setting sun. When I stood and turned to check my notes, I noticed a man standing beside the tracks about 50 yards ahead. That alone wasn't cause for alarm. It wasn't unheard of for locals to walk along the tracks, though this was a particularly remote stretch. What caught my attention was his clothing. He wore what looked to be a suit, but cut in a style that seemed decades out of date. Not quite antique, but definitely not current 90s fashion. In the fading light, I couldn't make out his features very well. I called out a typical greeting. The distance was too great for me to see his expression change, if it did. But something about the way he stood shifted subtly. He seemed to straighten up, his posture becoming unnaturally rigid. I took a few steps toward him. Then I saw his smile, visible even at that distance, just really wide and gleaming. I looked down for a second to close my notebook, and when I looked up again, I swear to you, he was gone. Just like that. The landscape didn't really offer anywhere to hide, just flat terrain with sparse vegetation. No one could have moved out of sight that fast. I finished my work for the day and drove back to the motel, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe a hiker who had ducked behind the rail bed? Maybe a trick of the light making a natural object look like a person? The rational explanations didn't quite fit, but they were better than the alternative. That night, I dreamed of the same man standing at the foot of my bed, just staring and smiling at me. I woke up sweating at 2:43 a.m., and I couldn't go back to sleep. The next morning, I called my supervisor, reporting the unusual measurements from Section 17, but I didn't mention the man I'd seen. My supervisor said the readings were concerning enough that he was sending another inspector to work with me for safety reasons. Rail integrity in remote areas isn't something the company takes lightly. A derailment in the middle of nowhere can cost millions, and potentially dozens of lives. My partner arrived late that afternoon. Funny enough, everyone called him Goob. He was an experienced and heavy-looking inspector in his late 50s, and he'd been working here far longer than I had. I asked about his nickname while we were driving to the site. He explained it referred to a snack he always carried, homemade goobers that he offered me from a paper bag. They were some kind of sweet, nutty cluster. Tasted pretty good. When I asked for the recipe, he just winked at me and said it was a family secret. Goob was exactly what you'd expect from a career railroader. Knowledgeable, no nonsense about safety procedures, but full of colorful stories about his years on the job. He was good company. As we worked through the measurements in Section 17, after what I saw, I was glad to not be alone for a while. The equipment issues continued. Goob's devices malfunctioned exactly the same way as mine had, and his watch stopped completely when we entered the section, starting again right when we left. Bizarre, huh? He frowned, but didn't comment beyond saying he'd never seen anything like the wear patterns we were measuring. We broke for lunch around 1:30 p.m., sitting on some maintenance blocks near the tracks. I was mid-bite into some kind of sandwich when I spotted him again. The smiling man. He stood about 70 yards down the track watching us. This time he was in broad daylight, so I could see him much more clearly. He wore a dark suit with a vest, hair neatly parted, and that same unsettling smile fixed to his face. His skin was pale, almost waxy looking, even from that distance. I nudged Goob and pointed, asking if he was seeing this man watching us. Goob squinted in that direction and shook his head, saying he didn't see anybody. So I described the man's appearance. Then Goob's expression got weird. He asked if I was sure about the clothing. When I confirmed it, he packed up his lunch quickly, suggesting we move to another section and come back to this one later. As we walked away, I glanced back. The man was gone again. That evening at the motel, Goob and I reviewed our findings over beers in my room. When the technical discussion was done, I pressed him about his reaction to my sighting earlier. He was reluctant to talk about it, but finally shared that his grandfather had worked the same rail line back in the 1930s. His grandfather had quit railroading suddenly after an inspection trip on this very section, refusing to ever discuss what happened, except to say he'd seen things that couldn't be explained. The family had assumed he'd witnessed a bad accident or found a body along the tracks, but my description of the man, in outdated clothes with an unusual smile, had triggered something in Goob's memory, a conversation overheard as a child, when his grandfather had too much to drink at a family gathering. I showered after Goob left for his own room. The bathroom was tiny, with just a shower stall and a plastic curtain. I was rinsing shampoo from my hair, eyes closed, when I felt something change in the air. Maybe a drop in temperature, I don't know. But I opened my eyes, and I saw a distinct silhouette through the shower curtain. Tall, motionless, standing just on the other side. I yanked the curtain aside in panic, sending soap bottles clattering, but the bathroom was empty. The door was still locked from the inside, exactly as I'd left it. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The following morning, Goob looked rough. He admitted to feeling nauseated and having a splitting headache. He also mentioned feeling like someone was watching him all night, despite being alone in his room, with the blinds drawn and door locked. After a couple of hours attempting to do some work, he decided to head back to base, promising to send another partner if available. Before leaving, he pulled me aside, away from the tracks. His usual tone was gone. He explained to me his grandfather had worked this section alone, after his partner quit unexpectedly. Whatever happened afterward was bad enough that the family never spoke about it. Goob warned me to be careful, and to consider requesting a transfer. Then he added something odd. He asked if I had a brother. When I mentioned Christopher, who had passed recently, Goob nodded, like this confirmed something to him, but then he just got in his truck and left. I continued my work alone now, methodically documenting the anomalies in Section 17. My unease grew as the day progressed. The feeling of being watched got worse, until it felt almost physical, like pressure on the back of my neck. One late afternoon, I was kneeling to check a particularly unusual wear pattern when I heard footsteps in the gravel beside the track. Looking up, I found myself face to face with the smiling man, now standing less than 10 feet away. Up close, he looked even more wrong. His suit was immaculate, but clearly from a different era, with a pocket watch chain visible across his vest. His skin had a bloodless quality that no living person should have, but it was his face that froze me in place. Features that initially seemed normal, but became increasingly unsettling the longer I looked. His smile revealed too many teeth, perfectly straight and white. And his eyes. I could swear they were normal when I first looked up, but as he stared at me, they seemed to darken until they were solid black, like dark ink being dropped into water. He then spoke, saying a name. "Christopher." I corrected him immediately, explaining that Christopher was my brother, and he was dead. The words left my mouth before I could even think better of engaging with this, whatever it was. His smile widened, as if that was even possible. Then he simply said, "Wrong brother." It was a voice that sounded like several people speaking in unison, but slightly out of sync. The blast of a train horn broke the moment. I turned instinctively toward the sound, and when I looked back, you guessed it, the man was gone. The eastbound freight rattled past minutes later. The engineer gave me a casual wave, as inspectors are a common sight along the tracks. After the train passed, I found my notebook lying open on the ground where I'd been working. Flipping through it, I discovered page after page filled with the same phrase, repeated in handwriting not my own. "Wrong brother, wrong brother, wrong brother." I finished my inspection as quickly as I could, then drove back to my motel. I was too shaken up to even consider stopping for dinner. In my room, I called my supervisor from the bedside phone and reported everything, the measurements, the equipment failures, and yes, the man with the impossible smile who knew my brother's name. To his credit, my supervisor didn't just dismiss my claims. He asked some questions about the rail conditions and promised to send a full team to inspect the section properly. I was so exhausted, I didn't have trouble sleeping that night, except when I was awakened at 3:19 a.m. Something felt wrong. The bedside lamp was on, but I was sure I had turned it off. On the nightstand were several small items arranged in a circle. My brother's pocket knife with his initials engraved, a silver dollar he carried as a lucky charm, his wedding ring. These were not items I just carried with me. None of them should have been in my motel room. The knife and coin were in a box of keepsakes I kept in my apartment. The ring, though, that had been buried with him. I checked out at first light, and I never went back to that section. I finished my reports, and that was that. Months later, I heard through company channels that a freight train had derailed there, despite the repairs that had been done after I left. But I wasn't told the exact cause. Last month, my nephew, I'll refer to him as James, Christopher's oldest son, now in his 30s with his own kids, was helping me clear out some old boxes from my garage. He found a folder of sketches I'd made during my early railroad days, mostly technical drawings of track components. But mixed in was a rough sketch I'd done of the smiling man. James asked who it was. When I saw it, it was instantly and terrifyingly familiar. I told him it was just some random guy I'd encountered on the job. But then he said something that alarmed me. Told me that his 6-year-old had been drawing a similar-looking figure for a while, a man with a very wide smile, black eyes, and a suit from an older era. I don't know what any of this means. I don't know what that man is or why he's fixated on my brother. But he better leave my freaking family alone.
Story 2.
Phantom of the Pork. You might think of this story as just another small-town ghost tale, but I'm here to tell you it's something more than that. Keep in mind, the exact names of places, the plant, and people have been changed. It was in the early 90s when my family packed up our lives and moved to the Oklahoma Panhandle. I'd been laid off from my job in Kansas City, and with the local economy offering few options, I needed a way to support my wife Cheryl and our 2 young daughters. Cheryl's cousin mentioned they were hiring at a pork processing plant in Gone. and we were desperate enough that it sounded like an opportunity knocking. We found a decent 2-story rental on the outskirts of town, a 3-bedroom with faded wallpaper from the 60s and squeaky floorboards that announced every midnight trip to the bathroom. The girls, Melissa, who was 8, and Jenny, who was 6, shared the upstairs bedroom with a window overlooking the backyard. At that age, moving was more of an adventure than a trauma. Thank goodness for that. The day we arrived, our neighbor dropped by with a casserole and a warning about the August heat. She told us we'd picked a rough time to move to the Panhandle, fanning herself on our porch as she mentioned we'd toughen up by winter when the wind comes sweeping down and freezes everything it touches. Westland Pork Processing was a short drive from our house. The place was enormous. Corrugated metal, concrete, and industrial efficiency, sitting isolated on the flat landscape like a butcher's fortress. On my first day, the plant manager, I'll call him D, gave me a tour. Shouting over the mechanical din, he bellowed proudly about how they processed about 1,000 hogs a day, sounding more like he was bragging about his kids' accomplishments. He explained I'd be working the cutting floor, with pay at about $10 an hour and overtime available most weeks, plus health insurance after 30 days. The work was brutal. I'd done physical labor before, but nothing like the repetitive strain of processing work. My shoulders and back screamed after every shift. The smell, though. Now that was something else entirely. It sank into everything. Clothes, skin, hair, and the insides of your nostrils. It was a mixture of blood, awful disinfectant, and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe just the meat itself about to turn. Every night, I'd come home reeking of it. My daughters thought it was gross and hilarious. Jenny would shriek, "Daddy smells like hot dogs gone bad," holding her nose dramatically while Melissa doubled over in laughter. Cheryl was less amused. She'd tell me daily to strip in the garage, put my clothes straight into the washer, and shower before touching anything. All in all, though, I was happy. We were going to make it. The pay was good and steady. We were catching up on bills, and the girls were adjusting well to their new school. You can't work at a place like Westland without hearing stories. In the break room, during smoke breaks, in the locker room, everywhere the men gathered, there were stories. Most of it was the usual workplace gossip. Affairs between floor managers and line workers, which person was a kleptomaniac, and which of our supervisors was a pushover. It didn't take long before I heard one story that kept resurfacing in different versions. I first heard it from M, who had been at Westland for years and worked one station down from me. We were eating lunch when he nudged me and nodded toward an older section of the plant visible through the break room window. Between bites, he casually mentioned that the area used to be the main kill floor back in the 60s, and that's where old Harold Weiss met his end. I asked what he meant by met his end. Still new enough to be confused by their jargon, M looked at me like I was dense. He explained that met his end meant he died. He told me it happened around 1970, that Harold Weiss had worked there for about 40 years. According to the story, Harold had tripped and fallen into one of the grinders with nothing left to bury but his left boot. I grimaced. "That's the kind of thing that grosses me out," I said. But M told me it gets worse. Clearly enjoying having a fresh audience, he explained that some folks believed Harold didn't trip at all, but was pushed by a certain other man who was allegedly having an affair with Harold's wife. I remember my first thought. 60-year-olds having love affairs? I hope I have that much energy when I'm that age. M said the guy worked the same shift as Harold and had the perfect opportunity, though nothing was ever officially proven. Over the next few weeks, I heard various versions of Harold's demise. In some, it wasn't a grinder that got him, but an industrial saw. In other versions, Harold had caught his sleeve in a conveyor belt that dragged him into the machinery. The details shifted, but certain elements remained consistent. Harold was an older man, his death was gruesome, and many believed it wasn't accidental. C, another co-worker, asked me one day if I'd ever heard noises coming from the oldest part of the plant at night. I told him I hadn't, though I'd only worked one night shift so far. C nodded seriously, warning me that I'd eventually hear something. He explained that the maintenance crew wouldn't go in there alone after dark, because they claimed to hear footsteps and machinery turning on all by itself. He added that one guy swore he saw Harold himself standing by his old workstation just staring. I laughed. Every workplace has its ghost stories, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't glance more often at that old section after hearing these tales. About 3 months in, I was working a double shift because we were short-handed. I was tired enough that the edges of my vision started to blur. On my way to the bathroom, I decided to take a shortcut through a rarely used corridor that connected to the older section. The floor was wet from condensation, always a hazard in food processing, and I was being very careful with my footing. I was halfway down the corridor when I felt it. A distinct pressure against my ankle, like someone had stuck out their foot to trip me. I stumbled forward, arms pinwheeling as I tried to catch my balance. To my right was an inactive grinder. Still dangerous, though. For a split second, I was certain I was going in. I could already feel the metal against me. My heart lurched into my throat, but I managed to catch myself against the wall, fingernails scraping the concrete as I regained my balance, panting. I spun around, expecting to see someone, maybe a coworker, laughing. But the corridor was empty. Completely empty. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, staring at the spot where I'd felt the contact. The light directly above that spot flickered out, plunging me into darkness. I called out, asking if anyone was there. It was hard not to sound scared and a bit panicked, but I didn't get a response. All I heard was the distant machinery from the active side of the plant. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that I'd slipped on the wet floor and imagined it. But as I hurried back to the main floor, giving the grinder a wide berth, a cold, old certainty settled over me. Something had tried to trip me, something I couldn't see. I didn't tell Cheryl about what happened at the plant. She was stressed enough with her job hunt and getting the girls settled in, and honestly, I thought I'd imagined it. Exhaustion plays tricks on the mind. But about a week later, something happened at home. I was alone in the kitchen on a day off, washing dishes while Cheryl took the girls to their new doctor for checkups. The radio was playing low, a country station that was one of the few we could pick up clearly. I was elbow deep in soapy water when I felt it, a firm push right between my shoulder blades. It wasn't violent, but it was substantial enough that I lurched forward, stomping into the edge of the sink, water splashing up and soaking the front of my shirt. I spun around, heart pounding. The kitchen was empty. I called out, asking if anyone was there. Feeling foolish, I checked every room, convinced we had an intruder. But all the doors were locked, and the windows were fine. No sign of intrusion. When I got back to the kitchen, the radio cut to static, a harsh burst of white noise that made me jump. When I tried turning the dial, it went right back to the country station as if nothing had happened. The incidents grew more frequent. Items moved from where we'd left them, cold spots in random areas, the distinct feeling of being watched while showering or changing. I tried to make sense of it. Was the house settling? Was there something odd about the ground? But I just couldn't explain it fully. The pushes continued, always from behind, always when I didn't expect it. Once when I was in the garage getting tools. Another time when walking up the stairs. There was even an incident when I stood at the stove cooking dinner and felt the push again. It was never harmful, not yet, but it was persistent, like someone trying to get my attention. After a month of these occurrences, I finally mentioned something to C during lunch break. I didn't tell him everything, just vague comments about feeling strange at the plant, how I felt like someone had tripped me that first time. C shook his head, laughing a little, acting like he'd told me so. To his credit, he was right. He leaned across the table and lowered his voice, surprisingly asking if anything had happened at home yet. My mouth went dry. I asked him how he even knew that. C sat back and crossed his arms. He told me it was Harold, that it had to be. You mean the guy who died in the accident? I asked. He nodded, confirming it with a quiet, mm-hmm, and explained that it doesn't happen to everyone. But those Harold takes an interest in. He trailed off, just staring at me for a moment. You kind of look like Harold, he said suddenly. Something about your eyes and jawline. I was starting to get creeped out, so I told him that was ridiculous. He said maybe, but there was a photo of Harold by HR if I wanted to check. Part of the memorial wall for workers who died. I went that very afternoon. The memorial wall was modest, a collection of framed photos with small brass plates noting names and their years of service. Most were formal portraits or candid shots from company picnics. Harold Weiss's photo was toward the end, a color photograph from what looked like the mid-60s. He had thinning gray hair, deep-set eyes, and a prominent jaw. The brass plate read simply, Harold Weiss, 40 years of service. C was right. There was a resemblance, nothing dramatic. We weren't twins or anything, but enough of a similarity to be striking. Same eye color, Same jawline, even the way our left eyebrow arched slightly higher than the right. I stared at his photo, and for a moment, I could have sworn his eyes looked right at me. It startled me enough that I nearly collided with a passing secretary. Sorry, I mumbled and hurried away. The activity at home intensified after I saw Harold's photo. Maybe he knows I know. The pushing became more frequent and stronger. We even started to hear doors slamming without any draft. The television turned on a few times on its own, straight to static in the middle of the night. Our girls complained about bad dreams where an old man stood at the foot of their beds, watching them sleep. Cheryl started noticing what was going on. One evening, after a shelf of dishes crashed down for no reason, she asked, "Is this place haunted?" I lied, helping her clean up the broken pieces. "It's just an old place, a bit unstable and creaky in places." I was very wrong, and the worst was yet to come. On a Tuesday night in November, I had just gotten home from work. I was in the shower, trying to wash away the smell of the plant. Cheryl was downstairs making dinner. The girls were in their room, supposedly doing homework. I had just turned off the water when I heard screams, terrified, blood-curdling screams. I threw on a towel and ran out, nearly slipping on the wet floor. The screams were coming from the girls' bedroom. Cheryl was already at the door, pulling on the handle, screaming, asking what was wrong. She shouted when she saw me that the door wouldn't open, that it was locked, and the girls were inside screaming. I yelled for the girls to open the door, rattling the handle myself. Melissa's voice came through, high and panicked, telling us they couldn't open it, that it was stuck. She cried out that there was a man at the window. Jenny was just screaming, her voice going hoarse. We'd never installed locks on the upstairs doors. There was no physical way that door should have been locked. I told Cheryl to stand back before ramming my shoulder against the door. Pain exploded across my collarbone, but the door didn't budge. I tried again and again. On the fourth try, something splintered and the door flew open. Both girls were huddled in the corner farthest from the window, clutching each other and crying. The window was wide open, cold November air gusting into the room. The curtains billowed. I rushed over to them while Cheryl closed the window. I asked what happened, who had opened the window. Jenny hiccuped through her tears, saying it was an old man, that he was outside staring through the glass. Melissa, shaking uncontrollably, nodded in agreement, saying the man was standing there, watching them, with sad eyes that looked familiar. My heart raced as I knelt down beside them, trying to calm their frantic sobs. Cheryl stepped in front of the window, scanning the dark yard below, but there was nothing, no one in sight. I checked the locks on the window and the door. Everything was secure. I turned back to the girls, confused and terrified. "There's no one out there," I said softly, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. Cheryl led the girls downstairs to calm them down while I stayed behind, standing at the window, staring out into the dark backyard. I didn't want to admit it, but something felt off, something I couldn't explain. I should have felt relief that there was no one out there, but I didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a gnawing sense of dread I couldn't shake. The house was too quiet, too still, like the calm before a storm. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, felt amplified in the silence. I kept thinking about the photo of Harold Weiss, his sad eyes locked on me. I tried to dismiss the feeling, but I couldn't. My mind kept going back to the same thought. Is he still here? The next morning, after a restless night, I told Cheryl what had been happening. She was skeptical at first, thinking I was just worn out from the job and the stress of everything piling up. But when I mentioned the door to the girls' room being locked from the inside, her face paled. She didn't say anything more, but I saw the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't sure whether to believe me or not. The following week, I worked a late shift at the plant. As usual, I took the same shortcut down the rarely used corridor. This time, though, I wasn't alone. There was an odd, almost unnatural stillness in the air as I passed the old section of the plant. I stopped for a moment, looking at the machines that had been out of service for decades, and something in the air shifted. It was as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling was suffocating, like I was being watched. A sudden noise broke the silence, a faint scraping sound from the far end of the room. I froze, my pulse quickening. There was nothing in sight, no movement, yet the sound persisted, Growing louder, it was the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My stomach churned. I didn't want to turn around, but my feet were frozen in place. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. Tall, hunched, and strangely familiar. The figure's face was obscured by shadows, but I could tell it was a man. The same height, the same build as the man in Harold's photograph. I bolted, not caring about the noise I was making as I rushed back to the main floor. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs were shaking. I didn't look back until I reached the exit. I don't know why, but I felt certain the figure was following me. I reached my car, slammed the door shut, and drove home, not stopping for anything. That night I told Cheryl everything. The figure in the plant, the noises. I finally admitted what I had been denying for weeks. There was something, someone, lingering in that place, and I didn't know what it wanted, but I feared I might find out soon. Cheryl was silent for a long time. Then she finally spoke. "I think it's Harold. I think he's still here, trying to get us to leave." I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't believe in ghosts, or at least I hadn't, but after everything I wasn't so sure anymore. The activity at the house only escalated after that night. It wasn't just the girls' room anymore. Cheryl and I started feeling cold spots in every room, hearing whispers in the hallways when no one was there. The television would flicker on by itself, turning to static and playing a soft hum that grew louder each time. The worst part was the feeling of being watched, that same cold stare I had felt in the plant, but now in the very house I had hoped would protect us. We knew we couldn't stay much longer, but we also couldn't leave without answers. Cheryl suggested we reach out to the plant, ask about Harold's death, see if anyone else had experienced anything strange. But something told me we already knew the truth, even if we didn't want to admit it. The night before we decided to move, something happened that I'll never forget. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. My heart stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling, but the footsteps didn't stop at the top of the stairs. They kept coming, right to our door. I held my breath, hoping whatever it was would pass, but it didn't. The door creaked open slowly, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of breathing. It was deep, labored, as if whoever, or whatever, was standing there had been waiting for this moment. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I didn't want to see what was standing behind me. I didn't have to. I knew who it was. In the morning, I told Cheryl it was time to go. We packed up what we could, said goodbye to the house, and left the Panhandle behind, moving back to Kansas City. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the only one we had. I don't know where Harold is now, or if he ever truly left that place. Maybe he's still wandering the halls of the plant, or maybe he's somewhere else, looking for another family to haunt. All I know is that we're safe now, far from the cold, quiet eyes that once followed us, and that's enough for me.
Story 3.
I hate that apartment from Rickham. My job brings me to a certain place that I have to go to because it's my job, but I hate it. That would be the apartment too. I clean apartments for a property management agency. When tenants move out, I go in with my supplies, clean everything top to bottom, take photos for the leasing agent, and move on to the next one. Most apartments do have their quirks. Some have water damage, others have carpet stains that just won't come out, no matter what you use. Then there's the one where people forget things, and you get to take home a little souvenir. Just kidding. I have to call management and let them know something was left, so the old tenants get a chance to get it back. But there is one unit I dread seeing on my work order, and yet it's the most frequent apartment I clean. This unit has had more tenant turnover than any other property I've ever serviced. People typically stay maybe 4 months at most, then break their lease suddenly. The property manager has told me they think it's the street noise or maybe past plumbing issues, but I know better. Oh, I've been in that apartment at least 8 times in the past years, and every visit, something happens. The first time it happened, it was subtle. I was doing my usual routine. Kitchen first, then bathrooms, bedrooms, living areas. About 10 minutes in, I heard something. It sounded like breathing, soft in and out sounds you'd hear from someone sleeping. I checked every room, thinking maybe the tenant was still there. Could have even been a squatter, but there was no one. The entire apartment was empty, but I swear, The breathing followed me from room to room, sometimes from behind, sometimes beside me. The feeling of being watched was so intense that I kept spinning around, expecting to see someone there. I rationalized it. Old ventilation system, pipes, my imagination after a long day. But I worked double time to finish the apartment, skipping my usual break. The second time was about 6 months later. A new tenant had moved out after only a few weeks. The apartment was a mess. Looked like they up and left in a hurry. I set my cleaning caddy down in the kitchen and went to check the bathroom for supplies. I couldn't have been gone for more than seconds. When I came back, my caddy was missing. I checked every room, thinking I might have absent-mindedly carried it somewhere else, but I didn't. I was getting frustrated until I happened to glance out the balcony window. There it was, my caddy, perfectly balanced on a tree branch that extended near the building. The balcony door was locked from the inside. The windows were closed. I was on the 4th floor. I called my supervisor, claimed I couldn't complete the job because I'd forgotten crucial supplies. I took the hit on my paycheck rather than go back in that day. There were other incidents. Faucets turning on by themselves, doors slamming despite no draft. One time my phone alarm went off with a voice note I never recorded, but I couldn't make anything out. But then the worst happened. The tenant had left after only weeks. The apartment wasn't even dirty, just some dust. The bathroom needed a little attention, but nothing major. I was almost finished. I had just packed up my supplies and was heading right over to the door. I even had my hand on the doorknob when I felt something cold wrap around my ankles. Before I could even react, I was yanked backward with incredible force. My chin hit the hardwood floor and I bit my tongue. My cleaning caddy went flying. Whatever had me dragged me across the floor, from the entryway through the living room. I clawed at the floor, almost breaking off my nails, trying to grab anything to stop myself. The thing pulled me into the master bedroom, then the bathroom, then back toward the second bedroom. I was screaming like a madman the entire time, begging whatever it was to stop and let me go. Its grip was like iron, freezing cold pressure around both ankles, like hands but larger. When it finally released me in the second bedroom, I heard a new sound, a low, rumbling laugh that seemed to come from the walls themselves, not amused, not friendly, but satisfied, like it had accomplished what it wanted. I scrambled to my feet and ran, leaving my supplies behind. I called my supervisor from the parking lot, voice shaking, and told them I wasn't going back to that apartment. I even threatened to quit, but they calmed me down and told me I didn't have to go back, thank God. I ran into the guy who would be doing it for me from now on. I thought about warning him, but instead, I just wished him good luck and walked away. Some things you have to experience first to believe, and I've had my fill of that place. I still have terrible dreams about being dragged across the floor, and I still wake up from time to time, almost still feeling that cold pressure on my ankles. I've heard ghost stories throughout my whole life. They're interesting, yeah, but I never knew a ghost could nearly kill you. But maybe I'm just exaggerating.
Story 4.
Do you guys also have workplace ghost stories? Well, here's mine and what it led to. I worked at this marketing place, an office building. HR went through all the usual orientation stuff with me, benefits packages, organizational chart, building tour, but there was one oddity I still remember clearly. When the HR lady showed me where the restrooms were located, she pointed down the hallway and explained that the women's restroom was the third door on the right. Then, almost casually but with a peculiar seriousness beneath her smile, she added that most of the women prefer using the restroom on the second floor. She didn't elaborate as to why, just mentioned it was more reliable and gave me a knowing look before moving on to show me the break room. It took about a week before I asked my cubicle neighbor about this strange recommendation. We were walking to get coffee when I brought it up, asking why everyone avoided our floor's restroom when it was clearly the most convenient one. She told me that there's been talk about the third floor ladies' room being haunted for as long as she'd worked there, almost 5 years now. The company had brought in maintenance multiple times to check for plumbing issues or electrical problems, which could explain the occurrences, but they never found anything wrong with the facilities. Eventually, management stopped investigating, and most employees just accepted the unspoken rule of using the second floor restroom instead. Naturally, I needed to know more. My interest was piqued. She hesitated, then shared her own experience from when she first started. She had used the third floor restroom before anyone had warned her about it. While in a stall, she heard soft crying coming from the stall next to hers. Thinking it was just someone having a rough day, she called out asking if she was okay. The crying instantly stopped. When she finished and exited her stall, she checked the neighboring one. It was empty. In fact, she realized she had been alone in that restroom the entire time. Over lunch that day, I decided to collect more stories, if there were any. A woman from accounting admitted she'd thought the haunted bathroom stuff was just office folklore, until her own encounter about 2 years ago. She considered herself a skeptic before then, and had deliberately used that restroom to prove everyone was being silly. While washing her hands, she clearly saw a woman with long, dark hair standing behind her in the mirror reflection. Kate turned around, but no one was there. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. She's used the second-floor restroom exclusively ever since. Other stories followed a pattern, indicating that people never felt truly alone in that restroom. Now, truth be told, I've always been fascinated by ghost stories. As a kid, I dragged my parents to supposedly haunted locations during vacations. In college, I joined the Paranormal Investigation Club, mostly as an excuse to explore abandoned buildings after dark. So, instead of being scared off by these tales, I was intrigued. One night, I had to stay late to finish a pitch deck for a client meeting. By around 9 p.m., the office was empty. Everyone else had gone home hours before. As I was saving my files and preparing to leave, I realized, probably foolishly, that this was the perfect opportunity to investigate the third-floor restroom without anyone else knowing. The hallway was dimly lit, with just the security lights on. I pushed open the heavy door to the women's restroom and flipped on the light switch. It looked completely ordinary and clean. White tile floors, 4 stalls, 3 sinks with a large mirror, paper towel dispenser on the wall, nothing ominous about it. I felt a little silly as I went about my business. Using the first stall, no ghostly cries or anything like that. I washed my hands and checked the mirror periodically, but I didn't see anything. I smiled and thought to myself, so much for the office ghost. I dried off my hands and began to head for the exit. The door had one of those push plates instead of a handle, the kind you just lean into to open. I pressed against it, but it didn't budge. Thinking I wasn't pushing hard enough, I really put my shoulder into it, and still nothing. The door felt like it was locked from the outside, which made no sense for a restroom door. Then, the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming, but an instantaneous blackout. There were no windows in that restroom, no other light source, so it was complete black darkness. My heart immediately began to race. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket to use as a flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. I had been at the office all day, and it was dead. I felt stupid. I already knew it was dead before even coming to the bathroom, so why even try? I backed away from the door, feeling my way along the wall until I reached the corner. I sat down on the floor, trying to control my breathing. It's just an electrical issue, I told myself. The door stuck because of some kind of pressure thing, because the ventilation's off too. But then I heard something, the soft, unmistakable sound of wet, bare feet on tile. The footsteps were slow. Slap, pause, slap, pause. They were moving across the bathroom floor towards me. I pulled my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible. The footsteps got closer until they stopped right in front of me. So close I should have been able to feel someone standing there. I held my breath. I couldn't move, or didn't want to. Something cold brushed against my cheek. Then not quite a hand, more like fingers of mist. I squeezed my eyes shut, though it made no difference in that darkness. Then all at once the light snapped back on with a harsh buzz. The sudden brightness was blinding. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that I was alone in the bathroom, but now the exit door was slightly ajar, swinging gently as if someone had just gone through it. I got to my feet in record time and practically fell through the doorway. I didn't stop until I reached the elevator. My hands were shaking as I gathered my things from my desk and left the building. The next day, I debated whether to tell anyone what happened. Part of me wondered if I'd just scared myself into imagining these things. But when I arrived at my desk, I found a small puddle of water below my chair, as if someone with wet feet had been sitting there waiting for me. Yeah, I use the second-floor restroom now. Some company traditions exist for a reason. So, guys and gals of the employed world, if you knew a bathroom was haunted at your workplace, would you go and use it on purpose? Would you attempt to throw a towel at the wet ghost girl, or just take it easy in the not-so-haunted bathroom down the hall?
Story 5.
The memory of the devouring flower. On the eve of departure, the red and yellow lights blazing above the northern sky, likely tantalizing the barbarous semi-humans who inhabited that frozen and unforgiving waste. The High Hyliodora. Dorna Coronel approached her least disastrous acolyte for final instructions. "You are to weed and water while we are gone on pilgrimage," she said, hissing her words through tight lips. "Should I remember to eat and drink as well? Perhaps to breathe?" "Yes, High Hyliodora," said Lysariel. "It shall be done." The priestess regarded her acolyte with undisguised suspicion, narrowing her eyes as she searched her reply for insolence. Finding none, she closed the knapsack and slung it onto her back with a practiced ease. "Against my better judgment, you are also to be left the keys to the shrine," she said. Lysariel merely gaped, all propriety abandoned to the shock of what the Hyliodora had just said. "Not my decision. I was outvoted," the priestess hedged, her displeasure showing in the way she threaded straps and cinched her waist-belt. "Nevertheless, the councils will be done," she said. "For Grunima's sake," Lysariel stuttered, habit insisting even through her shock. "For Grunima's sake," agreed the Hyliodora, who turned to leave, affixing the pack's tump-line to her imperious, habit-shrouded forehead. Halfway through the door to her cell, she tried to turn back to Lysariel, but she became momentarily stuck and had to be helped, a situation that improved her mood not at all, although now the acolyte knew why. "Keys to the shrine? I'm to tend the Heliorex?" "Remember!" the priestess was grunting, trying to regain control of the ungainly knapsack. "Ashes, water, sunshine, nothing else. Do you hear me?" She advanced until her face was within inches of Lysariel's. "Nothing else. It shall be done," she whispered. For a further moment, the Hyliodora glared. Then, without warning or preamble, turned on her heel and marched from the room. Her tromping, booted footfalls, heavy with resentment and the temporary abdication she'd been forced into, echoed in the unadorned stone corridors of the Abbey. In the wake of her despondent exit, a deep silence settled on the Abbey, a silence that echoed not only in its halls, cells, and courtyards, but in Lysariel's heart and mind. "Gone! She's finally gone!" She sat on the bed, relishing that peace as long as she could, and the longer she sat, the more it metamorphosed into energy. Excitement and liberation thrummed electric in her ribcage, like heat lightning from a summer storm. All of the obsessive oversight, the weight of the Hyliodora's paranoid gaze was gone. When she could take it no longer, and the excitement compelled her into motion, she leapt from the bed where she'd sat, and ran out into the corridor. Her feet flew, her heart leapt, and before long they carried her out into the sunshine and the verdant smell of growing things, past the courtyard of herbs and medicines, where yarrow, sage, and clove grew fragrant and tame, past the gates, where a pair of brethren watched her run, probably assuming to bid the sojourners a fond farewell. She even ran past the small, well-tended beds of roses that climbed the exterior, protective walls of the Abbey, where the hungry claw marks of great bears gouged the dark basalt, finally falling to her knees in the soft, tilled earth of her secret patch of cultivation, Grunima's highest calling. She delicately interlaced her fingers through the stalks of ghost irises, velthorn poppies, and black larkspur, the freedom to touch, never bruising the petals. Not that, but to feel the tactile sensation of the plants against the pads of her fingers was a forbidden bliss for which she had sufficient faith to feel at least a modicum of guilt. "Hello, my lovelies. At last we are alone." How the Hyliodora had discovered this secret patch of Lysariel's private projects, she had no idea. The woman had eyes and ears sprouting from her all over, it would seem. Her discovery, however, had earned her the only piece of praise she'd ever received from the woman. Earnest work, she had called it. A truth pruned so aggressively that it was likely to wither. Her experiments had yielded brilliant results. Miraculous. Huge. But, of course, all of that had come to an end once the great mistress of the Abbey had discovered it, folding her acolyte's discoveries into her own domain. After that, all experimentation ceased. Only approved methods would be used moving forward. Lysariel's protestations had been met only with obdurate silence, so the growth that had marked them remarkable had also halted. The Hyliodora insisted that the doctrinally common fertilizers, pruning, and watering methods would lead to a better outcome in the long run, but refused to elaborate on what that meant exactly. Worse, She had never once asked how Lysariel had achieved the results she had, from bulb to bloom in a week. And now, stagnation. Well, that wasn't entirely fair. The flowers were not stagnating, they were merely natural. This left Lysariel deeply unsatisfied, feeling that she had been on the verge of a breakthrough, only to be curbed by the human embodiment of self-perpetuating tradition. Ironically, she was too blind to see that it was the rediscovery of an older tradition that had led to the rapid germination and growth of Lysariel's beloved flowers. With a reverence she had missed, Lysariel placed the palms of her hands against the clean earth, closed her eyes, and focused her mind. "Tavure Grunima," she said, barely above a whisper. "By my will, O Sira, I become Emirval." As though not even a day had passed since last performing the ritual, the furnace of Thalma ignited in her belly. Instantly she became aware of the remains of her breakfast, digesting in her stomach. Her blood, too, was full of fuel she could feed that hungry fire. Beyond that, she was also dimly aware of her body's fat stores, the fuel of last resort. But what need did a botanist have of that? The texts, molded, worm-eaten, and only half intelligible, from which she'd gleaned and then adapted, these techniques spoke of fat burning as tantamount to death from starvation, which confused her. Wouldn't a priestess of Grunima prevent starvation with her talents rather than create it? Well, it didn't much matter in any event. She was always flush with food when she came to visit and nurture her little plants. The fire in her belly demanded it now that it was awake. Zelisos Marantara, seed to root. Gruthama, let the sacred soil be made. Tavure, hunger, I give that you may grow. At the invocation, the fire in her belly quickened, and she felt the nourishment she had taken flowing out of her, partly feeding the fire, but also lancing through her palms and into the soil. Through her connection, she sensed the richness with which she had invested her garden, far more than a handful of ashes could ever impart, and could even smell the promise of growth and bloom as its aroma rose from the warm soil. She ended the ritual before it burned more of her than she could spare. Lysariel stood, smiling, and admired her blooms. Already, they seemed to stand a little taller, their colors displaying a brilliance she had missed. Satisfied, she offered them a single benevolent nod and left them to their growth. Then she spun on her heel and skipped in the direction of the shrine. She had another secret to probe before the day darkened. The shrine to the Heliorex stood tall and vaulted on a crisply manicured lawn. The white limestone of the shrine featured tall, narrow windows of stained glass, and a pinnacle that featured an emblem of the sun in ever-bright hammered gold. The intended reverence, however, was somewhat muted by the common gardening equipment that the Heliorex's minders had leaned up against the building's white walls. A bucket, a watering gourd, and a bag of composted manure fertilizer all stood their post, looking listless and bored. Time to meet the deific unblooming blossom. The meaty stone key fitted the lock, though it turned only reluctantly. The bolt drew back with a sound like cracking bones, and Lysariel pushed the door, indistinguishable from the wall to the uninitiated, swung wide with surprising ease. If the lock had aged poorly, the shrine itself had clearly not. Coming face to face with the Heliorex, Lysariel's heart arrested for the space of 3 or 4 beats, then, mercifully, took up its old rhythm again. The bud was enormous, cyclopean even. It took up nearly the entire interior of the shrine, whose roof was twice again as tall as she. Beyond mere height, it was also as big around as the trunk of an ancient sycamore she had once met, a tree so ancient that it had stood rooted across 8 generations of her progenitors. That encounter had left her awed. The sheer scale of it, combined with the visceral memory of her first thaumatic connection to a living thing, had convinced her she would recognize true size and age when she met them again. Now, standing in its presence, she knew to a certainty, that nothing could have prepared her for this encounter. She'd craved it, dreamed of it, but could never have imagined it. Ash, water, and sunshine? And that's all? I don't believe it. Can't believe it. The common temples to Grunima, which peppered rural townships, concerned themselves with fertility, crop rotation, irrigation, and the countless methods of sustainable cultivation that kept civilization fed. This, in turn, allowed for the development of the arts, philosophy, economics, and craft, and yet it was mostly sustained by water, fertilizer, and sunshine. Somehow, Lysariel found the idea that this enormous, impossible blossom had been cultivated and brought to its current size only through pedestrian application of Grunuma's arts offensive. Perhaps it was because she knew the abbey was at least as ancient as the rituals she'd dug up in Grunuma's library at the basilica. Perhaps it was because she knew those rituals shaved time off of the cultivation calendar. Perhaps it was because she wanted to be the one to bring it to blossom. Whatever the reason, Lysariel the acolyte did not hesitate even briefly before plunging her fingers into the scrawny patch of bare soil surrounding the heliorex. Tavure Grunima! Where before the incantation had been a reverent whisper, now she spoke it with the fire of her conviction. In response, the fire in her belly kindled, not into the timid flame that usually awoke, but as a blazing brazier. Even in the heat of ambition, Lysariel did brace herself as she extended a hand to touch the bud. What would she sense when she connected to it? A part of her wondered what the heliorex even was. Certainly there was no other plant like it in the world. This thing was the abbey's entire purpose. A delicate velveteen coated the outside of the bud. Distantly, it reminded her of loquat leaves in early spring. It was, however, the only similarity she could draw between the alien plant and her own, admittedly extensive, tactile experience regarding the green and growing things of the world. Otherwise it felt spongy and pregnant somehow. More, even before she extended herself into the bud, she sensed its anticipation, as if it had been waiting. For her, maybe, or someone like her, someone who knew what she did, could do what she could. When she spoke the incantation, it poured from her as poetry. Gruthima Osira, my root to yours, Emerval in flesh, Zealosos in will, I open and become. As the power, Thama, in the language of the long dark Mercevian Empire, extended from her palm and into the plant, at first all went as she had expected, and had experienced before. But as her essence penetrated it, the heliorex reached out through the connection and seized her mind. Lysariel felt the will of the heliorex expressed not as fingers, but as tendrils of vine. A part of her knew this was only a mental manifestation of the plant's identity, just as her own essence had taken the shape of fingers, but that did nothing to dull the sensation. Ivy crawling into her skull, wrapping itself around her brain. She screamed, first in surprise, and then in pain as the vines bore down on the gray lump of meat behind her eyes. But no echo answered her. The shrine swallowed the sound the way dry, overturned soil drank rain. Then she began to see, to remember, and in her final moments, to be. Lysariel was a citizen of the sky, walking roads paved with a spongy flesh that reminded her of jellyfish. She went barefoot on these roads because life in the Sky City disregarded the need for shoes. Everything there was comfort, made to conform to the human shape. Nothing so intractable as steel or stone existed up there. The hardest substance they knew was crystal, and that was so responsive that it would grow or degenerate at a though or a gesture. Only, at the center of the city was the thing, the machine, the chaos engine, the choir of endings. A part of her wanted to dismiss it. Every Calanthian knew of it, though none of them had been told anything about it precisely. They simply knew, in that shared special way they had that none of the ground-walking humans of the world seemed to share. Yet, despite the lack of telling, and that special way of knowing, none of them seemed to know precisely what it did, if it did anything at all at the present, or would do. If the terrible machine was merely dormant and waiting to be switched on, nobody knew. Everyone was afraid. A dormant manifold stirred as she passed, and she felt her insides shiver. She'd heard stories, recently, about them. The flesh engines that ran Calanthea. Rumors of rebellion, which was so remotely improbable as to be ridiculous, and of nascent sapience among them, which was outright impossible, were beginning to circulate in the art houses and forums of the city. With a shiver, she dismissed these disquieting rumors and tried to enjoy her walk. Overhead, a sky leviathan flew its lazy track across the sky, a rider on its back, singing its strange song in perfect, distant harmony. Watching them brought her a moment of peace, of freedom she could forget, at times like these. And then, behind her now, the supposedly dormant manifold stirred again. Hadn't all the surplus manifolds been deactivated, just for peace of mind? Hadn't they council announced that they'd all... Harder this time, she pushed the thought away. Things were peaceful. The rumors were merely a potent piece of gossip. But a part of her still stirred. A part of her thoughts lingered on the choir of endings. A part of her wondered. All of these things passed through Lysariel's mind at the speed of dreams. It was felt, thought, sensed, and over in a breath. Then, her brain burst like an overripe fruit in a tightening fist. Blood cascading from her nostrils, she collapsed onto the soil. This time, the actual tendrils of the plant, which ran underneath not only the shrine, but the entire abbey and even into the very bed frames on which the priests slept, engulfed her and dragged her beneath the soil. One of the Brotherhood discovered the open door to the shrine and sighed. He saw the freshly turned earth, knowing what it signified. Another one, then. Taking a moment before relocking the shrine, he took a moment to gaze up at the heliorex. Was it larger? He thought it was, as though an infusion of hearty fertilizer had fed the thing. In some ways it was too bad, in others it was inevitable. Inexorably, humans were drawn to repeat the mistakes of ancient Calanth. They craved dangerous knowledge, power, and true autonomy, which any humble fool would understand was merely an illusion of the mind. Never mind that almost no living human had ever heard of the fallen cities of that long-lost civilization, or of the relics, potent, thaumatic, and incredibly dangerous, that they had left behind. The heliorex, of course, was one of these. As best as they understood, it had been a part of a living archive, used to store the memories of citizens for posterity. Once, supposedly, there had been thousands. Now, there was just the one. Well, the patriarchs and matriarchs at the highest levels did not want the thing destroyed, even if it could be destroyed. But they didn't seem to want its knowledge to spread either. So they cultivated it, kept it contained, and avoided interacting with it in a way that might stimulate it, make it remember. And yet, it had eaten another acolyte, apparently. What had she fed it? Manure? Foolishness. That was why it got her. She'd awakened the thing. Ashes were enough, though only barely. Keep it starving, keep it quiet. And yet, every once in a while, an acolyte with delusions would try to prod it into wakefulness, whether they knew that's what they were doing or not. Just so long as none of them learned whatever it knew. The nameless brother closed the door, ruminating. He was not looking forward to telling the Heliodora. This was the third acolyte she'd lost to this foolishness in her lifetime.